CZ actually just tweeted out on his account, he said, mandatory KYC for all services. Actions speak louder than words. So Binance, new customers will have to supply a government ID and pass facial verification to meet Binance's intermediate verification status. They're completely cracking down. This is the end of an era. Binance, which has been that free place where everyone around the world goes to and they can trade freely whatever they want, and now they're enforcing mandatory KYC across the board. And it's like interesting, you know, you can draw analogies with companies like Shapeshift. When they had to enforce KYC, they lost 90% of their business. So I'm not sure what's going to happen to Binance at this stage. And they're saying, oh, well, you know, we're complying, we're protecting consumers, yada, yada. I don't know. I don't think consumers are being protected. I think they're just being, their choices are being curtailed here. And, you know, other big news, big New York Times story came out that kind of digs into the fact that Brian Brooks left and the reasons around that and the control that CZ still has of all organizations, whether they're just, you know, affiliates like Binance US or Binance itself. But I'm going to throw to the group. Zach, I saw your hand go up. Let's dive into these two stories.
Yeah, putting the New York Times thing to the side for now, I think the KYC thing here is really the big story. This is a major move by Binance and trying to signal to all these regulators who are knocking down their door that they're taking this stuff seriously. CZ did not mince words in his tweet, and he is looking to demonstrate that, hey, we're playing by the rules now. But I will note, you mentioned Shapeshift. I think it's a really good comparable. I think this happened with BitMEX as well. BitMEX was under the eye of global regulators. They were long time resistant to the KYC process. And then they said, hey, we're rolling out KYC, we're going above board. And that did not stop the enforcement action that was served against them and their executives some months later. So if that's the playbook here, you know, the intrigue around what happens next with Binance as it relates to U.S. authorities has certainly been turned up a notch. That's entirely to be determined. But to me, that was the first thing that jumped out in this story. It's like, hey, wait a minute, this is deja vu. I remember this happened to BitMEX, and then sure enough, the crypto cops came knocking despite it all. So going to be really interesting to see what happens. But I think this is a really big story. And Naomi, you're right, sort of an end of an era for Binance here.
Absolutely. And I'll add to that with the Shapeshift analogy, I mean, the route that Shapeshift went down is they've decided to completely decentralize. They're getting rid of their headquarters. It's what Binance kind of tried to do with their whole, we're everywhere in the world, we're not headquartered anywhere. But Shapeshift ended up having to say, okay, we're actually going to dissolve the company. And that's why they're using things like ThorChain on the back end now, decentralized exchanges. It really does show what a need we have for decentralized exchanges. And I think it's going to really push things forward. You know, with the sorry, I lost my train of thought there. But let's move to the Brian Quinted's quote here that's on the screen. So it is very interesting if we're going the DeFi route, knowing what Gary Gensler just said this week, where he said, listen, we're cracking down on DeFi as well. You guys are not safe. And Brian Quintez brought up a great point. He said, from my experience, fraud usually involves a level of centralization and control as well as opacity. Query if those two conditions exist in a true full DeFi system. If not, how does the idea of investor protection change or shift from the government's to a participant's prerogative? So just such a great point there that, like, who's the SEC think that they're protecting people from if we do have truly open systems? Is it just about power? Are they just cracking down on companies because they don't like losing control? But Zach, I'll throw back to you for that.
Yeah, I think that bringing that up is very apt. And I think something that I'm certainly very interested in over these next few months is this idea of an escape to decentralization. Shapeshift was merely a bellwether for what's going to happen in the space as people get concerned about the regulatory crackdown that may or may not be impending. You know, sources I talk to say, hey, this is animating a lot of the decisions to move projects to a DAO structure. If we sort of obviate the need for this centralized point of failure and scrutiny, and we say, hey, this is run by the community now, there's some hope that might get projects out of this hot water that may indeed be coming for them. And I think, you know, Binance to their credit, may have been ahead of this, right? They set up Binance Smart Chain. We've heard comments from CZ in the past saying, hey, even if I step down as CEO, I'll still be involved in the community. It'll be a community-run project, but I'll be involved in it as any other community member would, even though my bags would probably be much larger than most other members of said community. And I think you're going to see that from a bunch of projects going forward. And it's going to be really interesting to watch if a regulatory rethink is out there, or if some of these old frameworks will be applied. Ben, I think I saw your hand, or maybe it was Will's, so you guys duke it out, and I'm curious for both your takes.
No, I think this is also going to be a really interesting flashpoint in terms of what the actual appetite is for things like DEXs and DAOs and stuff like that, right? Like, we're going to see who's going to be, what customer base and what level of that is just going to kind of stay where they are. We talked about the stickiness of Binance before. We talked about the appeal of centralized exchanges for a certain group of people. And so if we start to see large numbers of people migrate, I think that could be really, really interesting. But there is also a world where people are just like, oh, crap, well, okay, here's my ID. And then there is a smaller core of like hardcore interested individuals that go to DEXs. But the same way we talk about like why there's not a whole lot of popularity around decentralized social media, for example, and why people continue to stay on Facebook to the levels they are, I think this could be a really interesting maybe analogy to that, being more illuminating than some marketing might actually be purporting.
Yeah, Will, you jump in, and then I want to just add a note on that.
Yeah, I guess like last thought, just for myself, I'm wondering about FTX in this situation, seeing as they are just a huge player in the space, and that they kind of also did this FTX US brand and then FTX global brand. And I'm not sure if the FTX global brand has KYC or not. I'm not very familiar with their platform, but it is interesting to note that they also moved in this space right when all this regulatory action's happening. Zach, you brought up BitMEX. Arthur Hayes had to surrender to US authorities. Are we living in a world where CZ is not going to be welcome into the US anymore just because of how Binance operates? It's like an interesting question and like an unfortunate question also.
Yeah, I was just going to add in there, when you're talking about decentralized social media platforms and whether people are going to flock to DEXs, I think it's a slightly different situation because that need for privacy isn't really inherent in these social media platforms, whereas in exchanges, a lot of people really want to keep their money private. It's a slightly different issue. And one thing I would say is that is similar between them is that network effect. People don't go to the social media platforms because they don't have that network effect. DEXs traditionally have not had that liquidity. And so it's been really difficult to trade, especially move large amounts. But the difference is that now we have, instead of trading pairs, instead of someone on the other side of an order book, you have liquidity pools, which has completely changed the game. Ever since Uniswap, kind of ran with this idea that Bancor kind of came up with, it's really changed the game with DEXs, and now you have just giant amounts of liquidity there, which are being tapped by increasing numbers of people. So very interesting to keep an eye on this.